Hello everyone. Today our topic of discussion is the atlas. So out of the 7 cervical vertebrae, the atlas is one of the atypical vertebra. Okay, the atlas, the axis and the 7 cervical vertebra are the atypical vertebrae. Okay, now this is the atlas. Okay, now it's actually a ring of a bone. By the shape you might understand. Okay, now the reason for being it called so is because it supports the skull above. Okay, so it's an articulation with the skull at its occipital condyles. Okay, so it supports the skull above. So it's one of the main important bones of our axial skeleton. Okay, which keeps the skull in proper posture. Okay, now let's talk about its features. So first of all we have this facets. Okay, now there are upper facets and lower facets. Now the upper facets are called the superior articular facet. Okay, so these are the superior articular facet and these are the inferior articular facets. Okay, the superior articular facets and the inferior articular facets. Now the superior articular facets articulates with the occipital condyles of the skull. Okay, so I think you remember, see, these are the occipital condyles of the skull. Okay, now these are convex and the superior articular facets are concave. They are deeply concave so that they are in proper occlusion with this occipital condyles. Okay, so it helps in keeping the condyles in the grip of the atlas. Okay, so this is how the articulation takes place. Okay, the superior articular facet in relation with the occipital condyles of the skull. So it is a ellipsoid variety of synovial joint and a biaxial joint. Okay, now let's talk about the atlas a bit more. So it has an anterior arch and a posterior arch. Now the anterior arch is small compared to the posterior arch. Okay, now apart from these two arches it has two lateral masses. Okay, so these are the two lateral masses of the atlas. Alright, now the projections you see here, this long distinct projections, these are called the transverse processes. Okay, these are the transverse processes which project out, okay, from the lateral mass. Now you may see this foramen on either side of the transverse processes. Now these foramen are called the foramen transversorium. Okay, so these are called as the foramen transversorium. Now some important features and which are quite distinct for the atlas is that it has no body and no spinous process. Okay, now the atlas, this is one of the peculiar feature of the atlas, that it has no body and no spinous process. Okay, now you might get confused that why not the body of atlas is present. Actually the body of atlas is shifted vertebra, which is the axis. Let me show you. See, this is the the second cervical vertebra. Okay, and this is the axis. All right, now this vertical projection, this vertical bony projection which you see here is called the odontoid process or the dens. Okay, now this is often regarded as the lost body of the atlas. Okay, which is shifted to the second cervical vertebra. All right, so it's often regarded as the lost body of atlas. So the atlas in relation with the skull. Okay, so I have shown you that this is how the atlas is in relation with the skull. Okay, now they rotate togetherly at this axis. Okay, so the axis actually forms the vertical axis in its terms that helps in rotation of the, sorry, it's not properly articulating. See, which helps in rotation of the head, okay, on the atlas. So that being said, atlantoaxial joint, okay. Now by the name you may understand that when the atlas and the axis, they are in relation to one another, okay, at this point, see, in this region where the inferior articular facets of the atlas and the superior articular facets of the axis, okay, that join each other and form the atlantoaxial joint. Now the atlantoaxial joint is a pivot variety of synovial joint, okay, so it's a pivot variety of synovial joint. Now let's talk about the anterior arc of the atlas, okay. Now this is the short anterior arc of the atlas, and this is the posterior arc of the atlas, which is longer, okay, compared to the short anterior arch. Now if you observe it clearly, you may appreciate over here this anterior tubercle, okay. Now this anterior tubercle provides attachment to the anterior longitudinal ligament, okay. Now when you see the anterior arc in its posterior aspect, see there is a deep flat longitudinal impression, okay. See this deep flat longitudinal impression, I hope you may see it, see. Now this provides the region where the dents may settle and freely rotate, okay, and it may freely rotate around its vertical axis. So this is where the dents, see, this is the facet of the dents, and this in relation to this flat longitudinal impression helps the axis in movement around the vertical axis, okay. So this rotatory movement helps the skull along with the atlas to move as a whole, okay. So this is one of the most important joints, the atlantoaxial joint, okay. Now to be more specific, it's a median atlantoaxial joint or a uniaxial joint, okay, which permits rotatory movement. Now upper margin of the anterior arc, it gives attachment to the anterior atlanto-occipital membrane, okay. Now let me bring the skull to show you that how the anterior atlanto-occipital membrane is present. See, this is how the atlas, okay, lodges in the convexity of this occipital condyles, and anteriorly, see, I hope it's now visible. Now anteriorly this atlanto-occipital membrane is present, which helps in the attachment of the occipital bone with the atlas, okay. Now let's come to the lower margin of the anterior arc. Now in the lower margin, see, this is the lower margin of the anterior arc. Now it provides attachment to the anterior atlantoaxial membrane, okay. Now the anterior atlantoaxial membrane, by its name you may understand, it's in relation to both atlas and axis, okay. It actually helps in filling the gap between these joint, okay, the anterior atlantoaxial membrane. Now let's discuss about the long posterior arc. Now this long posterior arc, unlike other cervical vertebrae, okay, now in other cervical vertebrae you may have seen this bony plate called the lamina, okay. See, this is one of the cervical vertebrae, okay, a typical cervical vertebrae. So in this typical cervical vertebrae you may appreciate this bony plate, okay, which corresponds to this posterior arc of the atlas. Now this bony plate is called the lamina. This is the spinous process, okay. This is the body. So the body in the spinous process is not present in the atlas. So these were a few quick points. Now I told you that unlike other cervical vertebrae, the posterior arc represents the lamina, okay. Now there is a groove, if you may see it clearly over here, okay. Now under these facets Now, these provide the passage of the third part of vertebral artery. Okay, so this will provide the passage of the third part of vertebral artery. Now, between the artery and the posterior arc will run the first cervical nerve. Okay, the first cervical nerve will run between the artery and the posterior arc. Okay. Now, the remaining of the posterior arc, okay, it provides attachment to the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane. Okay, so let me bring the skull once more. See, the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, okay, will provide attachment, okay, around this posterior margin of the foramen magnum, okay, and the occipital bone. All right. So this is how it provides attachment. Now, the floor of the occipital triangle, the floor of the suboccipital triangle is formed by the posterior margin of this posterior arch. Okay, the posterior margin of this posterior arch and posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, which I just have shown you. Okay. Now, between the lower margin of the posterior arc, okay, this is the lower margin of the posterior arc and the lamina of the axis. So this is the lamina of the axis. Okay, there's bony plate which you see. This is the lamina of the axis. So between the lower margin of the posterior arc and the lamina of axis will be present the tendons. The highest fibers of ligamentum flava. Okay, so between the lower margin of the posterior arc and the lamina of the axis, here will be the highest fibers of ligamentum flava, okay, which will ultimately help in filling this gap between the atlas and the axis. Now, if you observe clearly, there is a posterior tubercle. Okay, see this posterior tubercle. I hope it's visible. Now, this posterior tubercle will give attachment to the slip of ligamentum nuchae throughout the cervical spine. Okay, so the ligamentum nuchae will be present throughout the cervical spine. Okay. Now, on either side of the posterior tubercle will be present the rectus capitis posterior minor. Okay, the rectus capitis posterior minor muscle, which ultimately forms the boundary of the suboccipital triangle. Right. Now, talking about the superior articular facets, so these are largely concave, okay, elliptical, and it converges anteriorly. Okay, and the lower facets or the inferior articular facets, they are circular, flat, okay, and they are directed downward and medially. Okay, so they are directed downward and medially. Now, there is the transverse ligament of atlas, okay, between the tubercles. See, these are the two tubercles, okay, under the superior articular facets. So these tubercles give attachment to the transverse ligament. Actually, the transverse ligament is present so that the dens of the axis remains in proper position, okay, while rotation. So the transverse ligament is present in this fashion. Okay, it helps in locking the odontoid process and helps in free movement of it, okay, without getting dislocated. Now, let's discuss about the transverse process. Now, the transverse process, so these are unusually large, okay, compared to other cervical vertebrae. Okay, now these provide an efficient lever for rotation around the intervertebral joint. Now, the tip of the transverse process corresponds to the posterior tubercle of the cervical vertebrae. Okay, so the tip will correspond to the posterior tubercle, okay, of the transverse process. Okay, and the anterior tubercle will be marked as a small projection, okay, on the anterior side. Now, unlike other cervical vertebrae like this one, see, the transverse process had distinct anterior and posterior tubercles, but in Atlas they are not present. So this is one of the unique features. Now the bone of the transverse process, okay, so these represent the costotransverse bar, okay, these represent the costotransverse bar in front of the foramen transversorium. Now the transverse process of Atlas has no anterior root, okay. Now I told you that the anterior tubercle is represented by minor tubercle on the anterior surface of the lateral mass, okay, somewhere around here. Now the transverse process gives attachment to the rectus capitis lateralis and the superior oblique on the upper surface, okay. Now on the upper surface, so I am repeating once again, it will give attachment to the rectus capitis lateralis and the superior oblique, okay, and it will give attachment to the inferior oblique muscle at the tip, okay. Now ultimately the superior oblique and the inferior oblique muscles will form the boundary of the suboccipital triangle, okay, the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. Now at the lower end of the transverse process, okay, the lower aspect and laterally, there will be three important attachments of the slips of levator scapulae and scalenus medius, okay. Now transverse process is related in front to the internal jugular vein, okay, so it is in relation to the internal jugular vein in front, okay. Now the tip of the transverse process, okay, now the tip of the transverse process, it's in relation to the spinal accessory nerve and occipital artery and is covered by the parotid gland, okay. So let me show you how actually the cervical, the atlas lies in the lateral aspect of the skull, okay. So suppose this is where the mandible is located, okay. So look this aspect very clearly. Now see, this is the mastoid part of the temporal bone, this is the mastoid process, and this is the angle of the mandible. Now between the mastoid process and the angle of mandible, this region, okay, this region is generally the region of the parotid gland, okay. So this region is covered by the parotid gland. Now the atlas lies over here, okay. So it lies over here, sorry. Okay, so now if you deeply palpate, okay, between the mastoid process and the angle of the mandible, so you may feel the tip of the transverse process, okay. So this is where the atlas is actually located, all right. Now let us discuss about the structures passing through the foramen transversorium, okay. Now the foramen transversorium, it passes the vertebral artery, the vertebral vein, okay, the vertebral artery and the vertebral vein. Now the vertebral artery is one of the first branches to arise of the subclavian arteries, alright. Now all of the cervical vertebrae, okay, they have this hollow vertebral canal, okay. Now they form the tubular vertebral canal which contains the spinal cord, its meninges, spinal nerve roots, okay, blood vessels supplying the cord, vertebrae, joints, muscles and ligaments, alright. Now this was pretty much about the atlas, okay. So hope you understood well. Thanks for watching.